So with all of that data in mind, we now need to figure out our value. My little face is always in the way. Okay. So we're going to take all that information and crunch the data. So we need to account for geographic location. We need to account for the minimum wage and the living wage in our areas that we're looking at, cost of living, especially if you're in a very expensive city, the market rate, which we can get from the salary survey data and job boards or things like Glassdoor that have job roles in your city and what the ranges are. And then we have our job description, whether we're already employed or looking at a job that we're applying for. And so while there's no definitive equation, you will likely feel more comfortable setting a range. And so I'm going to go through an example with you. We're going to look at the numbers for that particular example, and then you'll see how you can use that information to figure out what your own value might be, and having those conversations and making those weighted judgments in terms of I am in a cheaper cost of living city, or more expensive, or I have 5 years more experience than entry level, for example. So all of those things we need to keep in mind as we start crunching the numbers. Okay, so choosing Charlotte, North Carolina, I am using the example of I am a head of archives and special collections, making $60,000. And for this particular one, I'm going to say that I'm working at, it's like a nonprofit historical society. So not academic, not government, because those would be a little easier to calculate. So I know from the 2019 salary survey that the average for my state, North Carolina, which is not my real state, my example state, the average appears to be $66,000 to $66,298. Sorry. And then I know from looking at the general schedules for federal positions, I consider myself at the level of head of archives and at 15 plus years experience that I should be a GSA 1420, which is the archivist code, level 10. And let's say, for the sake of argument, I've been in this position several years. If this were a government position, I estimate around a step 5. And I see that that should be $67,547. And then I think about my peers, or I take a look at my schedule, the survey for my area, and I'm seeing that they're making anywhere from $65,000 to $75,000. And to see about a $10,000 gap is typical for some areas, because you've got anywhere from federal contracts or elite private but academic schools, all the way down to local rural community museums or archives, etc. So having that $10,000 spread is actually not unusual. One thing to keep in mind when we're taking a look at peers is that, especially if you're in an area where there's not a lot of archive or museum or whatever your type of institution is, you're not going to have a lot of data, and not all of your positions are going to be exact matches. So when I had to do this for myself in Oregon, where that it's this similar case, there's not a lot of similar organizations or position types, it can be difficult to try and do an apples to apples comparison. So you will likely have a range, and that's fine, and it takes some creative thinking around that. And then when I look at the GSA price list, so thinking about history associates and thinking that I'm like a senior level whatever, I see that the annual rate for them is about 93,000, but that is contractor rate, and that is also private firm, which will pay more. And so I would need to adjust down, obviously, for that. So looking at all of this, I can see that my $60,000 is less than any of the data available, especially for my area. And so I know that at my $60,000, the next lowest that I can see that's even close to me is 65. So I know that I at least should be asking for 65, and then have room to argue. My next one I would probably pull is the salary survey for my area, which is 66, and then also looking at government, which is 67. So At $60,000, my minimum goal would be 65 and my stretch goal would be 67, knowing that some of my peers are actually making 75. And if my organization was to go with a private firm, they'd have to pay 93. So, with all of those in mind, that would be my takeaway from crunching these numbers for my area. So, taking a moment, wait, what about consultants? Especially because I did get a question about this for somebody who's going into consulting. So, we're going to take the hourly rate at your a traditional job. So, if you have a traditional job or your most recent traditional job, whatever your hourly rate was, and then you're supposed to add in expenses, administrative time that a client wouldn't necessarily pay you directly for, and yet is required in order for you to run your business, and then taxes, which you include employer and employee, and this all calculates to an hourly rate. However, when you are new starting out, you are not going to know things like expenses. And unless you have a really good handle on your income and your partner's income, if you need to factor that in, you may not have an exact idea on what sort of taxes you might be looking at either, let alone like how much administration time you might need to run your business, because we all run ours differently. So there's a lot of variables here. And I did a whole 1 hour webinar, Basics of a Consulting Business, for the Independent Archivist section. Even if you're not an archivist, all of the business basics apply. If you go to my FAQ and scroll down, you can check out that webinar for more details on all of this. However, what I would recommend is one of two things. The popular tip you'll see on many of the blogs out there is that you would take your traditional job hourly rate and times it by 3, and that is your consulting rate. So, remembering those firms, like I would have been 93,000 a year working at History Associates as a private contractor. If I were to have divided that by 3, I would have gotten an hourly rate for my traditional job. So, which is what I go down to in my tip. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead, but so you can either do the simple hourly rate times 3 for your consultant's rate, but then I would also verify that with the position descriptions for things like History Associates to see what they're charging and have you adjust accordingly. And then of course factor in any sort of location, services you provide, etc. So these are good to get you close to what your hourly rate would be as a consultant, and then make those adjustments. And if you would like more information, I go into more detail and spend more time on this, but I did want to do a bookmark here for those that are considering consulting, especially in a year like this one.